Hi, welcome to Digging with Dan. Israel wanted a king like the nations around them. 1 Samuel 8, 5 and 6. In doing so, they rejected God, 1 Samuel 8, 7, who was to be their ruler. However, He would give them their desire, verse 22. Humble Saul had been both king and commander, 1 Samuel 9, 16 and 17, and 1 Samuel 10, 1 and other passages. Because of sin, 1 Samuel 15, 2 through 9, God rejected Saul as king. See that in verses 10 and 11 and verse 26. The Lord had Samuel anoint the next king, a young shepherd named David, 1 Samuel 1 and 11 through 13 and 16, 7. Later, it was the time when kings go forth to battle, 2 Samuel 11, 1. Saul prepared to defend Judah at the battle of Elah, 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 3. The Philistines sent forth their champion, who taunted and ridiculed God's people, 1 Samuel 17, 4 through 10, who in response cowered behind rocks and anything they could find, verse 11. It was at this time that this young shepherd, who was anointed the future king, David, was sent by his father to carry supplies to his brethren who were in Saul's army, 1 Samuel 17, 12 through 19. Though David was only doing as Jesse had commanded him, verses 20 through 22, his oldest brother would question his motivation, saying that he was just there looking for a fight. Verse 28, he just came to see the battle. David there heard Goliath's taunting. He saw Israel's fear. He basically asked why no one had met the challenge. He answered his brother, and he volunteered himself to answer the giant. Verses 23 through 32. Even though the commanding King Saul opposed the idea, verse 33. Ultimately, this shepherd boy was able to convince Saul to let him fight, verses 34 through 39, and David prepared for the battle, verse 40. He stood up to the approaching Philistine who ridiculed him, verses 41 through 44. But confidently, David told Goliath that David stood for God. And Goliath was about to, and the host which he represented were about to die, because the Lord was with David. Verses 45 through 47. At that point, David ran at the enemies. Not just Goliath. He ran toward the camp of the Philistines, Goliath in between. He slung a stone, and he felled the giant, cut off Goliath's head with Goliath's own sword, verses 48 through 51. Heartened, Saul's army chased the fleeing Philistines for several miles, verses 51 through 53. David celebrated his victory, verse 54, and he was celebrated, 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 and 7. As a result, David was taken into Saul's company and taken into his home. He grew close to Saul's son Jonathan, chapter 17, 55 through 18, 5. Over time, Saul became angry, jealous, and fearful. So he began to seek opportunities to kill David. 2 Samuel 18, verses 8 through 17 and 28 and 29. Even though he ultimately took him as his son-in-law, verses 17 through 27. David remained righteous. David increased his reputation against the Philistines. 1 Samuel 18:30. Most have heard all of this, especially that regarding the battle itself. For David versus Goliath is yet a euphemism for taking on an enemy against which one should have no chance. In fact, we will often hear when people are talking about a sporting event, a David just defeated a Goliath when someone that's unranked defeats a top 5 team, for instance. Our children grow up singing about the little boy David who was down by the babbling brook. We want to consider more deeply what took place in this event. We start with the question, where did it happen? It happened in the valley of Elah. The Shephelah is the buffer zone between the Philistine coastal plain and the hill country of Judah. It's logical that David's fight against Goliath occurred in the Shephelah. The Philistines spread out along the west and south sides of the Elah Valley in the towns of Azekah, Ephes-dammim, and Soka. Philistine victory would allow access to hill country ridge routes toward Bethlehem and Hebron. With this divide and conquer strategy, the Philistines could cut off Judah from Saul's Benjamin-based monarchy. Judah's support for Saul hinged on Saul's success in this battle. Saul must have established camps in the hill country and as much as he dared on the hill along the northern side of the Elah Valley. David, with his supplies for his brothers, traveled from Bethlehem down the Hushah Ridge route to the Elah Valley, some 15 miles, and the better part of a day's journey. With a stone from the Elah brook, he overcame Goliath, probably near Soko. All of that was from Schlegel's Satellite Bible Atlas, as he gives a great picture of that location. J.W. McGarvey, who traveled the land extensively in the late 1800s before writing his book Lands of the Bible, wrote this regarding the area. To meet this description in an area where the armies could be in the positions that the text says they were, a place in the valley of Elah must be found below Shoko, which Schlegel had called Soko, which has on each side a mountain slope suitable for the camp of an army. Again, it must be where the valley is wide enough to admit of Goliath's daily advance into it with his challenge. And finally, it must be where a brook flows along the valley, a brook with smooth round stones in its bed, and nearer Saul's side of the valley, so that David would cross it in starting to meet the giant. Now, precisely, McGarvey continued, such a place is found a short distance north of Shoko, and nowhere else in this valley. Its bed is full of smooth, round stones, from 1 inch to 6 inches in diameter, and with scarcely a moment's hesitation, David could have picked up the 5 to suit his purpose. No identification in all of Palestine is more satisfactory. So where did it happen? It happened exactly where the Bible says that it would have happened. Why did it happen? Well, we need to consider the history between Philistia and God's people. Egyptian texts suggest that the Philistines were part of a large-scale immigration of various tribes from the Aegean, referred to as the Sea Peoples, who attempted to enter Egypt. As they made their way by land and sea down the Mediterranean coast, they left a swath of destruction behind them. The tribes arrived at the border of Egypt around 1177 BC, but were repulsed by Ramses III. They entreated to Canaan and settled in previously conquered areas. The Philistines seized one of the choicest parts, the southwestern coasts, which became known as Philistia, that according to the Archaeological Study Bible. The Jews and the Philistines would butt heads often. Joshua 13, 1 through 3, Judges 3, 3 and 4, 1 Samuel 4, and other passages. There were a number of differences between the Philistine and Jewish systems, which made them naturally be at odds. The Philistines, for instance, were uncircumcised, 1 Samuel 17, 26 and 36. The Philistines worshipped the false god Dagon, Judges 16, 23 and 1 Samuel 5, 1 through 12, 1 Chronicles 10, 8 through 10. The Jews, of course, were circumcised, and the Jews worshipped Jehovah. Let's consider for a moment the idea of champion combat as we consider how it would have happened. We think it odd in this day and age that one man would come out and represent one army, and another man would go out and represent another army, and that would be what decided the battle. And yet, that is exactly what happened on that occasion with Goliath challenging Israel to send forth her best man, which happened to be a shepherd boy. Battle by champions was the tradition in the ancient Near East. Such battles differed from duels in that they had ramifications for entire armies or nations. The strongest member or champion of each party fought a similar representative of the opponent to the death, and the victory of one man vindicated the entire host, the Archaeological Study Bible said, and it continued. Such single combat was practiced based upon the belief that the gods of each army actually fought or decided the battle. Therefore, only one champion was needed from each side. Well, how did it happen in the sense of these two champions? First of all, you had that giant Goliath, 9 foot 6 inches tall, 6 cubits and a span. What did he look like? We have an idea of his appearance based on, according to Alfred Hirth, reliefs commissioned by Ramses III and other depictions of Philistine and Aegean military personnel. Goliath would have worn a bronze helmet, a banded corselet, and bronze greaves in his legs. He would have been accompanied by a shield bearer. Goliath had a javelin over his shoulder, carried a spear in his hand, and wore a sword on his belt. That from Hirth's book, Archaeology in the Old Testament. On the other hand, you had David, a small, young, red-faced, in modern vernacular, a pretty boy. He had a sling which was capable of hurling a projectile at over 100 miles an hour at a distance of over 100 yards, again according to Alfred Hirth. Did it really happen? That is one of the great questions of our time. The Bible clearly shows that the Philistines not only existed but also exercised extensive power at this time. Much of the biblical indication concerning the Philistines, however, used to be doubted by the critics. Pfeiffer, speaking of the time of Samson, referred to the legendary and fabulous beginnings of the conflict with the Philistines. Archaeology, on the contrary, has given factual evidence concerning the power of the Philistines. It's probable that this evidence has caused Pfeiffer himself to admit that in the days of Eli and Samuel, 1 Samuel 4, the author continues the story of the same conflict on solid historical ground. That according to Joseph Free in his Archaeology and Bible History. The force of the argument that geography and the Bible agree depends on several considerations, McGarvey said. First, on the number of the points of agreement. Second, on their minuteness. Third, on the unstudied manner in which they are introduced. And finally, on the entire absence of disagreements between the land and the book. In other words, when one goes to that location and he sees that brook and he sees those stones and he sees those hills situate and he understands how champion versus champion combat would have worked, he can see this event taking place. But there's more. The Khirbet Qalifa ostracon, discovered in 2008, is a 5-line inscription written in faded ink on a piece of pottery. The ostracon was found in situ, in place, on the floor of a house west of the North Gate, and according to Hassel, the assistant director of the excavation, based on pottery and carbon-14 dating, it is securely dated to the early 10th century BC. It says, the cursing of the Anak, the giant, the Anakim would be the plural of that, against the servant of God. The servant of God has judged the man. Yah has judged. Goliath is dead. David is the master. I forget the source of that quote, but that helps us to appreciate this was a real event.
This has been a presentation of GBN, the Gospel Broadcasting Network.